Hi, everybody. Good to see you coming in. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the last day of the conference, be it morning, noon, or night, where you are. So thanks for attending today's session. It's called Culture and Lean, a look at the underlying assumptions in higher education in the auto industry, and it's going to be run as a 45-minute learning session. As you've heard in other sessions, just some quick housekeeping, please stay on mute during the presentation, and if you want to turn your camera on so we can engage with your lovely faces, that would be fantastic. Comments and questions can be popped into the chat, and we'll give those out towards the end of the session for answering. And please note, like the other sessions, this one is being recorded. Now let me introduce the presenters of this session. It's my honour today to welcome, I to see some of the Chris show, thanks Phil, to welcome Chris, Shannon and Christopher Kluse to present. Now over to them, and please everybody enjoy the session.
Okay, thanks very much and welcome everyone. It's Friday morning my time. I know it's evening for Chris, most likely in Toledo. But evening, Chris.
Absolutely, 7:30.
So I'll just start with an acknowledgement of country, and I'm sure you would have heard these quite a few times in the conference already. I'm on Turrbal land in the north of Brisbane. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and pay respects to elders past and present, and who continue spiritual and cultural connection to country. So just a little bit about Chris and I. I've been a manager in higher education for over 20 years. I worked in government before that. I guess most recently, I wrote a book on collaborative problem solving, and some of you may have heard Candace Beckman from University of Texas Arlington and I talk about that yesterday. I'm really excited to be doing this presentation with Chris, given his background. I don't know, Chris, if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you're going to keep going in that. So yeah, I'm Chris Kluse. I'm an associate professor at Bowling Green State University. I've been there since 2015, and prior to that, I was in the automotive industry since about 1995, where I was 100% automotive, and I was even involved in it a little prior to that.
So we actually met via Bill Balzer, who was at, or probably still is at Bowling Green, but in an emeritus capacity. And so Bill, Chris, myself, and another guy, Mikhail, also from BGSU, are working on a paper, and Chris and I had lots of other conversations and wrote a different paper, and this presentation is based on that. That's the paper, coming out any day now in the Journal of Management and Engineering Integration. And so we've had lots of discussions over time about the culture of higher education, and it's really interesting listening to Chris talk about the culture of the auto industry versus higher education. I worked mostly in government. I did work a little bit in private enterprise prior to that. Had a similar experience of coming into higher education, and it is quite a unique culture. We've also talked a lot, as I'm sure lots of people have, from this conference, about why it's so hard to implement lean in higher education. This is not unique to UQ or to BGSU. I know this is a kind of a global conversation that's going on. And then we started to think, well, does A plus B equal C or anything? And so that's sort of what we got into in this paper.
Yeah, part of it for me was, when I first started coming from the automotive industry, I didn't really know that lean was even prevalent in higher education. So I heard a little bit about it, but I got this call, or I actually got an email from a guy named Bill. He kind of introduced me to the concept of lean in higher education. And I started getting fascinated by it, even though it wasn't my role. So that's kind of how I got into it.
So this is the research problem as stated in the paper. And as I said, the presentation today is really drawing from that. So there's two slides that are a bit busy. This is one of them. Hopefully you can read it. I think the slides and the recordings will be available to everybody, and these tables are in the paper as well. So we started with really talking about, well, what are the kind of elements of lean that are, that we can look at and say, well, what's going on in the auto industry, what's going on in higher ed? And so we ended up settling on these 4 kind of characteristics: how widely accepted, what's the rationale for using it, is there a sense of urgency, and what are the elements of it that are in use? And when we were talking about it, I mean, in a way, it seems really obvious to say, well, yes, it's widely used in the auto industry, and yes, all of it is used in that industry, and yes, it's core to what happens there. It's where it comes from. But it occurred to us that we couldn't find anything where people had been looking at it specifically across the 2 industries in this way. And so a summary of that slide, obviously lean is applied to the core business of the auto industry, and it's fundamental to how that happens. It is applied it's applied mostly, I would say, to administrative functions in universities. There's a small number of people who are really looking at how to use it in their academic work, but it is more of a nice to have. I don't know, Chris, whether you want to expand on that.
Yeah, so going back to a little bit on the research problem aspect, I got into it because this particular paper in general, when I was in the lean automotive industry, it was kind of something that we just did. It wasn't really talked about as much as it is in higher education. It's just part of what you normally did. So when I got into lean in higher education, the thing that kicked this research off in my conversation with Chris was, I just don't know that it just seemed like lean is a great tool for higher education, but it just seemed like it was not. We were trying to force fit things into lean. It wasn't coming naturally, and that's when it led us both down the cultural aspect. Is maybe there's just a cultural difference that is more of a natural barrier to lean. That's what we need to overcome to really make this thing a success.
So when we started talking about culture, again, we looked around and we couldn't really find anything looking in detail at the culture across the 2 industries. And I realize saying culture of higher education, I mean, as Bill said yesterday, something like 20,000, 25,000 universities around the world. There is not one culture. So we've had to generalize, but I think there are some things that are really quite specific to higher education, just as there are to the auto industry. We settled on Shine's 3 levels of culture as a frame through which to look at these things. And I know Chris uses this model in his teaching as well. Shine says, well, there's kind of three levels. There's the artifacts that you see, and they can be things like uniforms or physical layout, or they could be policies. When I thought about this, I thought there's a chain of chemists in Australia called Chemist Warehouse. No matter where they are, when you go into them, they have that same industrial look. They've got concrete floors, just metal racks. Everything about it tells you this is a discount provider. It's very obvious in the artifacts. And then there's the espoused beliefs, which is what the organization or the culture says that they believe in, and you see this on mission statements up on walls. And then beneath all of that are the underlying assumptions which drive what really happens. And so we thought this would be a good frame to try to drill down into what are some of the underlying things in each industry that make them fundamentally different, and might give some clues as to why not just lean, but any sort of continuous improvement might struggle, but particularly why lean is not easily applying across industries. So just Edgar Schein talks about it at a cultural level, and just as a quick example, one of the things Schein talks about is you cannot bring your assumed knowledge from one culture into another. And I guess this is maybe particularly Chris's experience of coming into higher education and saying, well, I don't even see lean here. Is it here? So if you look up a pentagram, you'll find quite different meanings of it across different cultures. And so if you were in the culture where it signifies earth, air, fire, water, spirit, and you went to the culture where it signifies mathematical perfection, they think that you were very strange if you were talking about it based on your understanding. So the message from that is, don't bring your assumed knowledge. You have to look with fresh eyes at what you see. As an example of the differences really between an espoused belief and an underlying assumption, um, you may be aware of, I work in an organisation. I don't want to be critical of my organisation. I think in some ways it is very bold and innovative, particularly in its research. But when I look at the way we make kind of governance and institutional decisions, I'd say a lot of the times we are actually quite risk averse in the way we go about things. So just as an example of the difference between the espoused belief and the underlying assumption playing out in different ways. And so just drawing an example from the paper, the artifact might be the performance planning procedure and forms. And, consultants get paid a lot of money to come in and say the individual plan must align with the department plan, which must align to the university plan. And we have this wonderful cascade, and we all understand that we are here to, put the man on the moon, like from the NASA example. But as a school manager, I know that doesn't always play out that way. So as a school or a department, I might want an academic to be equally interested in teaching, research, and service, and might say, well, which committee would you like to chair next year? And they may well quite justifiably say, I don't really want to chair a committee. I want to focus on my research. That will get me my fellowship. That will buy me out of teaching to do more research, and my career takes off. So in a broad way, of course, that aligns with the university because research drives prestige, but it doesn't align across all of the dimensions. So again, Chris, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Just a word about the artifacts. I think we settled on this framework for a couple of reasons. One, the artifacts, it was easy to, I felt it was somewhat easy to take very tangible things between the two disciplines and kind of link them to lean. And for example, in the world of automotive, there's a specific quality standard that everybody who supplies automotive has to meet and march by. And in that standard, there's a lot of lean practices that you inherently have to comply with already. And we don't have that in higher education. So just that artifact alone, the culture of automotive to march to the lean beat is just something that it's ingrained in you kind of have to do. And it's also something that is really, we'll talk about a little bit later, is really necessary for even being competitive. Without it, you're probably not going to be competitive. You're probably not going to survive.
Yeah, so we settled on Shine's 3 levels of culture and thought this is a useful frame to look at what's happening. And so I've got another very busy slide coming up. So the earlier slide was, what do we see of the kind of different dimensions of lean at play across the two industries? And in this one, we really tried to drill into what are characteristics of both industries or of businesses and universities within them that would relate to how lean is being deployed. And we settled on these 5: team focus, financial expectation. You can see the 5 there. And so just coming back to what I was saying before about the individual, in the top right corner, there is a planning process as an annual planning process as an artifact. But if you were to say, well, what are the artifacts that support the contention that it's actually the individual performance that drives the career? Things like H indices and the way you win fellowships, there are actually some very strong tangible things that you can see in higher education that do support what we say would be the underlying assumption. So, Chris, I don't know if you want to say more about this slide before we drill into the 2 specific areas.
I'll talk about a couple of the elements. I mean, so the other ones that kind of came to my mind as just things that jumped out when I first got into higher education, and even now as I've been in it for 7-8 years full time, things like team-based, activities. Again, it's kind of ingrained in the culture, but it's also part of survival, and it's essentially a requirement. Again, the quality standard that you have to be certified to as an automotive supplier dictates teamwork in several areas. I know that people who are involved in lean know some of the tools. And one of those, for example, is a FEMA. And a FEMA, if you don't do it in a team-based function, it's not very good. When you get looked at by an auditor to be registered as an automotive supplier, they literally audit to make sure you're doing teamwork. So not only is it an artifact and it's ingrained, it becomes part of the culture because you just can't get away from it. And as you move into things like some of the more obvious, like final product, certainly it's much easier to measure the final product in automotive, but there's also no argument about who the customer really is. In universities, it's hard to define what that customer really is. Is it the student? Is it the society in general from the research? So there are some cultural differences there that allow a little bit more conducive for lean, and maybe a little bit more, you gotta be a little more flexible in the higher education area to fully adapt lean. And we'll talk a little bit more about financial and quality here in a moment.
And just, I should say, Jay, on teamwork, I'm not saying that there is no teamwork in universities. I mean, obviously, if I come back to the researcher, as they build their research team and their program, they do assemble a team, and that team actually contributes to their success and to the institution's success, but not in terms of survival the way Chris describes in the auto industry. So I guess it's the proximity of the teamwork to the survival of the institution that's really noticeably different.
Yep.
So I'll let Chris, I'll let you talk to the dive into the next two areas.
Sure. So the focus, the financial one, was that we pulled this out as being a little bit more significant than the others. Me and Chris were just discussing the paper at one point, and this topic came up. And I was describing to him of how automotive typically works when you launch a program. So you get a chance to bid on a program. It's usually 5 years in length. And you offer a particular price. And once that price is accepted, what is also required is every year that price goes down by a certain negotiated percent. So whatever price you give to the OEM, Chrysler, GM, whoever, you have to have efficiency gains and give them money back every year based off that initial cost. So if you do not get lean and you do not get better, you end up losing money because they come and actually audit you and make sure you're only making a certain percentage. So lean becomes a necessity. And if you don't hit your margins, you can't tell them, sorry, I didn't hit your margins. You take the money anyway. So that's why it's such a matter of fact that you have to, it's ingrained in the culture that every day you must get better, or you won't be there in a couple of years because you're gonna lose out on that opportunity. And I think in higher education, it's a little bit of a different model with costs rising every year, and it seems to be okay that happens.
I'd say it's a very different model, and I think this conversation, the conversation Chris is describing, was really the catalyst for us saying, let's do this more. Let's really investigate this, because I can tell you, certainly in my university, with 90% of your cost being salaries and a lot of people being tenured, the underlying assumption is cost goes up. It goes up through enterprise bargaining agreements. It goes up through recognition of CPI. And so I was fascinated by a model of cost goes down and contract value goes down, or you're out of business. I think it's a very big difference.
Absolutely. Right. And then similar to the financial, we talked a little bit about the importance of quality in the industry. And again, we go back to the tangible versus intangible a little bit. It's a little harder to define quality in higher education, I think. In the auto industry, it's much more tangible, obviously, but it's also very accepted across the suppliers and the OEMs of what you specifically measure. And as you go back again to this IATF certification you have to adhere to, everybody has to have that certification. Everybody has to be part of that community. Everybody has to be practicing all these things. And within the guidelines of this certification, all the elements they talk about for improvement and mandatory procedures all build in things that are in lean without even mentioning lean. So almost by default, you're already doing that. And in an industry, you get a scorecard from your customer every month about how your performance is. And if your performance is not good, at some point you may lose that business as a result. We don't often get that kind of feedback in higher education. So we don't go back to the earlier slide where we talked about where sense of urgency was there. We don't have that pressure necessarily to every single day try and get incrementally better because we have to. So I think that's a huge cultural difference that helps drive, you know, a little bit more ease of lean in industry versus the higher education aspect.
Yeah, and again, so my school actually does quite a lot on quality of teaching. We are sort of collectively interested in it. And my university has become a lot more interested in quality of teaching, say, over the last 5 to 10 years as well. But I would say that it actually, a lot of it is still what I would call passion projects by individual course coordinators or program directors. And I know from observation that they sometimes struggle to get funding for those things. Not so much in the last 5 years, and certainly COVID was a real kind of game shifter in terms of looking at the way we can deliver quality remotely. But it again, to me, it hasn't been there hasn't been the proximity to survival that Chris describes in the auto industry. It's been more, I personally am interested in quality. I want to do these things, and I have occasionally struggled to get funding and opportunity to even do that.
Yeah, and you know, another kind of an example of support really came up with me for me today. We have a very big accreditation visit coming up to our college on Monday and Tuesday, and it's ABET accreditation for engineering. It's a pretty big deal. It's a very similar process to getting IETF certified in automotive. It really is. But the glaring difference that I noticed today as I was looking at the schedule, when they come to an auto industry manufacturer for the standard, they spend the majority of their time at the product in the manufacturing floor, like 60% of the time, auditing that to make sure that's going well. I looked at the schedule. I'm the program manager for my ABET accredited program. I'm on the schedule for an entire 2-day visit, probably a total of 3 hours. So I kind of mean, it goes back to the focus on the product and then the sense of urgency, because that, I think, if you improve the product, we're going to increase enrollment in higher education. If they're going to spend 80% of their time with all the administrative functions, it's probably value added, but I think you want to make sure because the programs attract the students. So it was just something that hit me today as I was working on the remainder of these slides.
Yeah. So quick summary of what had been a very busy slide. Auto industry is team-based. HE is largely structured on individual careers. The cost expectation, I have to say, I've chatted with people at my own institution about this, and the eyes widen at just the fundamental differences in assumptions about cost. And quality control for survival. You know, the next slide is where we talk about, well, where to from here. And one thing that I've been thinking about in Chris and I's chats and leading up to this presentation, and also sitting in some of the other presentations at this conference, is that there's probably an underlying assumption about time that we hadn't thought about, that universities, many of them have been around for hundreds of years. You know, I think we work on quite a different time scale as an underlying assumption about survival. So what can be done? I guess some general observations based on what we've been reading and what we've been thinking about. The closer lean can be to the core business of the university, the more likely it is to have that wider acceptance. It was interesting listening to Bill Bowles's talk and using the 5 hurdles from the voltage effect, and not quite sure. I think some of what we say might actually contradict some of what Bill was suggesting yesterday. Lean where it adds most value, so local and targeted implementation might be a good way to go forward. Personally, the most success I had using lean in my institution was actually with a veterinary teaching hospital, which was an unusual thing to be inside of a university. But I think the critical thing was that it owned all of its processes from end to end, and it, other than, you know, the enrolling of students and that sort of thing, and they didn't have to go in and get buy-in from a half a dozen other people in a much larger complex bureaucracy to make change. They owned it. It was local, it was targeted. They all understood the value of why they were doing particular things, and wider use of lean practices. And I'll hand over to Chris, the other Chris, really, to talk more about this.
Yeah, so I also, what can be done as I think through this, I still fully support lean in higher education, and I would just love to see it much more prevalent. The things that I always felt can be done is maybe it's a lot of times people talk about this as not the approach, but I think it might be the approach is cherry picking what does work in higher education may not be a bad thing. There's a lot of papers that talk about not to cherry pick. It's got to be the holistic implementation. And while I support that, there's just some things that don't translate well to the higher education community. I always talk, me and Chris, I've talked tons of times about just-in-time manufacturing. It's a pinnacle portion of lean, but the way it works in automotive and the way it can work in higher education, I just don't see the connection. And I don't know why we would try and force ourselves into that. Things like 5S and such. I was just in my office today and I went into our supply cabinet and there was probably enough Post-it notes for the next 15 years. Same with staples and pens, right? And now I can go through an initiative. I can make it look beautiful. I could put Kanban in and it will look great. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to save hardly any money and I'm not going to get more students. So I think focusing on the core things like looking at the processes that have a lot of waste in them, program approval processes, hiring process, all these different processes that will make the university money. That I think is where the value can be that that lean brings. And maybe we look at it from more of a lean in higher education where we have our own unique version of it. And we drop some of these things that maybe are not as transferable to higher education based on just tangible aspect and the cultural aspect.
And I should just make clear too, I'm not saying not RIE, because I actually love rapid improvement
Absolutely.
events. I think they're a fantastic cultural activity as much as a process improvement activity. I just think back to my own experience of really getting a couple of weeks of training and then being let loose on the university. And I wish I had had a larger, wider toolkit and more experience at the time and not sort of really just had the one thing in my toolbox. But I think RIE are actually really good. It was interesting, the talk I think John and Krista gave yesterday about coaching, and they were talking about, and lots of people have talked about this too, really tying the cultural aspects of all of this more clearly into it and getting that understanding at the leadership level that what we're doing is not just about, it's really not about trying to save dollars, it's about transforming the mindset and transforming the way people go about things, and then all sorts of benefits will flow from that.
And I also agree with that, Chris. The RIE, I think I know Bill's on the call. One of the things I think I've talked to him a couple of times about was if we would just have every department do like one significant Kaizen event every semester successfully, I think just that alone could be incredibly powerful. If you could just instill that mindset and get everybody on the same page on something, almost as small as the RE, but that could be so powerful and so significant that I think it could be a game changer.
So we just want to finish with this quote, which we both really like. And as we've talked about it, we, in a way, kind of like it for different reasons. And I thought that was interesting. And again, maybe part of the cultural aspects. So when I saw this quote, I thought, yeah, wow, I love this. They're starting out, they're trying different things, they're being innovative. If it doesn't work, do something else. And the lean higher education community is like this. We take things, we adapt them, we make up our own. It was interesting in the talk I did with Candace yesterday. They use things that I came up with in quite a different and a way than I do, and in a way that I wouldn't have thought of doing. I think that's fantastic. So for me, this quote is really, the highlight of this quote for me is about innovation. But when I was talking to Chris about it, he actually saw something quite different.
Yeah, I kind of had to take on it with more of the last portion of the quote, where if something was, we need to change something right away. And it goes back to one of the first really busy slides we had, which talked about sense of urgency. And that's the one thing that I think culturally is a challenge at times with lean in higher education, is the sense of urgency. And I go back to examples of when you're building a product. If you're building a product just in time and there's a bad part, it's getting shipped no matter what in the next 45 minutes. It's going on a vehicle and they're going to pull it offline. They're going to charge you for it. So you have to have sense of urgency to fix that. I found that some of the processes that need to be addressed, while everybody believes they need to be addressed and they know they're important to be addressed, there's not really the gun to your head per se to have to get them addressed. So that's where I thought the end of the quote where it said we need to change it right away when something goes wrong. Culturally, I don't see that type of initiative. And that's the kind of thing that lean can bring to higher education that I think can be very beneficial.
Yeah, so I think we may need to do an updated version of the paper at some point, because I think we probably did miss an underlying assumption about time, which has really only become evident to me in the last few days as Chris and I got ready for this presentation. Universities, I think, do work on quite long timescales, and I don't think survival features much in our thinking. Expansion and contraction, and downsizing and rationalization of departments, but I actually can't think offhand of a university that I know of that has closed down. I can just think of new ones that have opened up. So we are now at the point of questions and comments.
Lots of questions have come through as well as comments. Should we start with the top?
Sure. Yeah.
So I think you've got a comment from Bill. Bill, did you want to speak to that?
I'd be happy to. I just have to go back and see what my comment was. But it was, I was thinking over the past couple of decades, or maybe the past decade, I'll say, a lot of the regional accrediting bodies in the United States, like the Higher Learning Commission, which was just at BGSU, and NETSHE, which is a Northeastern accrediting body, they're now expecting continuous improvement sections in the self-studies. That is, you just don't say, look how good we are. You have to have a section in there saying, and here's how we're getting better. So this is what we're focusing on. These are the experiments we're doing. These are the results we're getting. So I thought it was just kind of an interesting twist to building more CI into higher education.
Yeah, they definitely have that element, Bill, the continual improvement, because our ABET, the one thing that is different that I see between the two is they have the same element in the automotive, in the certifications. They allow the same auditor to come back for a 3-year cycle, then they cycle them out. So he or she can truly see what's going on improvement-wise because they go to that same plant. ABET is different. ABET says that auditor can't come back again. So whatever I present Monday, I can present something different and show I improved. And I wouldn't fudge anything, don't get me wrong, but I think it's a better model if someone can follow it through for a couple of years. Because I know they've built that into it, and I kind of like it that's built into it because it does keep some of the faculty on their toes, which we sometimes need.
Maybe I was asked to, that was maybe more of an observation. The question I had for you, both of you though, was, you talked about culture, and I always like to hear how culture, impacts what we do. The focus tended to be more like on continuous improvement in culture. Did you see any differences in like respect for people, the other, pillar of lean between automotive and higher education as you were going through this?
I didn't find anything in the literature like that, Bill. So when we did the article, we actually got a reviewer comment that said, a lot of the stuff that you've written, we haven't found, there's not a lot out there on it as far as the culture between the two. But he also suggested that there is stuff out there, go look for it. So one of the things we're doing right now is actually trying to find more support for that. So the answer in short is no. But I can just take your example from last night of an observation when you mentioned about the administrator is the person, you bring the problem to them, right? They solve it, bring me the next problem. But the lean model is go down to the lower ends, the faculty, let them solve it themselves, or whoever that, or administrative staff, whoever that is. And I thought to myself, culturally, that's a colossal change for higher education. If someone's been brought up through the ranks as a professor, into a dean, into chair, all those different positions, that's kind of all they know. So culturally, that's to me, perceptually, a significant change.
Thank you. We have a lot of comments from Tammy. Tammy, I wonder if you're still on the line and still would like to make a comment or questions from one of the ones that you wrote.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Hope you're all good. Really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. And I think looking at comparing culture between automotive and HE, I think is really interesting. And perhaps also linking it to the aerospace industry. So I grew up with aerospace. I remember in the 1990s, we were using Ford's manual for quality, for our continuous quality improvement cycles. And it's really interesting to think about how culture sort of emerges within industry, and then really thinking about culture within HEIs. But I think it's quite nuanced, isn't it, depending on your country, depending on how you're measured. So in the UK, we're measured with our national student survey, we're measured on retention rates, on employment rates after 6 to 8 months, all of these types of things, and measures drive behavior. So one of the things I put in just at the end is how do you think the unions affect culture in the automotive industry and higher education? So in the UK, I'm in the UCU and we're being balloted for industrial action at the moment. And it's really interesting, I think, about how that's going to play out, because all the academics I know really care about their students. It's a vocation passion for them. And now that I'm a pracademic and working in professional services, I can see that sometimes as professional services, we're quite remote from the student experience. And I think what's really important for me in that role now is sort of sharing how it feels to be in the academy, how it feels to be giving a lecture, what happens when you turn up at 10 to 9 and none of the IT is working, and you've got to run a hybrid session. So all of these things, I think, they are nuanced and really interesting. And I love that you're using Edgar Schein's sort of framework for culture. I think it's a really good one to look at. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks.
So I think union membership in higher education in Australia is very low. It might be 15%, something like that. So I wouldn't say that there's a big sort of union impact on culture. There is quite a large issue going on in Australia at the moment around what I would call the systemic underpayment of casual teaching staff. And it's mostly been because they've been paper-based, uncontrolled, kind of locally managed systems. But there's a lot coming out, which is being led by the unions, on millions of dollars of underpayments as a result of individuals saying, well, my budget's really tight, I'm not going to pay you a lecturer rate, I'll pay you a prac rate or some other rate. And years of this kind of being an accepted practice. But other than that, I wouldn't think unions have had a great impact on culture. I'd say it's more our institutional practices. You know, we have a lot of tenure. We've got, can be challenging to manage poor performance, can be challenging to exit people who perform poorly. So whether that all comes from a sort of a unionized post-industrial birth of the country could be true, but I'd say right now it's probably more our internal instruments rather than anything external.
Thank you. We also have a question from Candace. Did you find alignment with the espoused belief that individual plans will align with the organisation? So were there alignments with the voices of the organisation and the employees?
I don't know that we found that, Chris, during research. As far as anything in the literature we looked at, I think from experience, I can say, I've two different large companies I work for, it kind of aligned, if that's an answer. It wasn't great, right? And that's, it's not to say that, the other misconception that seems to come out with lean in automotive is that everybody does it and they do it well. That's not true at all. It's not even close to being true. I used to visit hundreds of suppliers that all did lean, and there's really only one Toyota out there that does it really well. Everybody else is still trying, just like we're trying in higher education. So you talk to someone about how well they do lean in automotive, they're going to tell you we're not doing it very well. I'm sure. So to answer the question, I don't think we found anything in literature with the alignment aspect. Chris, do you recall?
No, I'd agree with that. No, it's more, I guess, our shared observations and from talking to other people. So not a particularly rigorous way of assessing it. But I think probably the example I gave before is the most common. That broad alignment. But when you get down into the detail, and not at the organizational level, but at the kind of the department, the school, the org unit level, is where you see the friction more, because of what I would say is a kind of a misalignment of an accepted career track and a way of succeeding from what the institution sometimes needs. So.
Thank you. We've still got a few more questions, but we're almost at time. Does anyone want to come off mute and ask one final question? Or make a comment?
And we can get the chat questions and send them through to the Chris's, if that's okay with the two Chris's, for any comments that haven't been responded.
I can see Krista's question at the end, and I'd say yes, we are primarily talking about academics and higher education rather than non-academic when we're talking about these differences. And I suppose that's really because we were looking at, well, what's the core business? And to me, the professional staff or the non-academic staff work in partnership for the university to be successful, but it's the academic who is kind of doing the teaching and leading the research. I'd liken it maybe to like a law firm or an advertising agency, where you've got the people who are in the profession, and then you've got the people who are supporting the delivery of the profession.
Well, thank you everybody for your participation in this session, and to Chris and Chris for what was very, very informative and just so interesting, seeing the differences, and just hearing, Christopher Kluse talk about trying to spend time where it's the most value. I can see the stationery cupboard from my desk, and it just makes me giggle. So yeah, I think it was just amazing. So thank you so much for your talk and for everyone who attended today. And we hope to see you at some of the other sessions later this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, depending on when you're tuning in from.
Very good.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.